Dude, we're gonna go through LYSENKO now, okay, guys? Sit tight. Get ready to be LYSENKO pilled. Okay. New developments in the science of biological species. To this day, no clear-cut definition of the term species exists in the history of biology, in the science of biology. Yet every biologist, as he observes living nature, and particularly the practical farmer, the agriculturalist dealing with plants, animals, microorganisms, let me intervene, the barefoot, practical people, the actual people working with this stuff in everyday life, is struck first of all by the fact that all interconnected organic nature consists of separate, qualitatively distinct forms. For instance, in practical agriculture, it is self-evident that the horse, the cow, the goat, the sheep, and wheat, rye, oats, barley, carrots are separate, qualitatively distinct forms of animals and plants, respectively. The same thing is true of wild animals and plants in free nature that environs us. Everybody can distinguish between the oak, the birch, the pine. Let me simplify it. Okay, TLDR, we can all see there's different organisms, there's different life forms. But also, especially for those actually working for them, with these things, you can also sense this on a very intuitive level. Like, these things aren't only different from a scientific perspective, but from a very practical, hands-on perspective of a farmer, for example. A farmer knows these are all different. They work differently. They're all different, these life forms. It is of such separate forms of plants, animals, and also microorganisms, as has already been stated, that interconnected living nature consists. These forms of organisms, which do not interbreed under the ordinary conditions of life that are normal for them, or when they interbreed do not produce normally fertile offspring, forms which are physiologically incompatible are species. Remember, guys, what was Darwin's famous work called? It was called The Origin of Species. So this issue is resting upon species. What makes organisms and life forms different? What makes them different? If you can answer the question of what makes them different, you can answer the question of what they even are in the first place. What makes them unique? What makes them their own life form, as opposed to, in practical farming, and still more so in free nature, there are many cases where the same name is applied to forms, species of plants and animals, which, although closely related, are known to be separate and distinct and ordinarily do not interbreed. For instance, ordinary soft wheat, durum wheat, one-grained wheat, emmer wheat, and others are called wheat. Besides the dandelion proper, several other separate and distinct forms, species, which ordinarily do not cross, are also called dandelion. Therefore, in order to draw lines of demarcation between the concepts of these forms, i.e. species, a binomial Latin nomenclature was long ago introduced into the systemics of botany and zoology by Linnaeus. Thus, triticum vulgare is common wheat, durum wheat, and you get it, one-grained wheat. The first part of the designation, the noun, for instance, wheat, is the generic name common to all closely related species, which in practice or science constitute one genus. The second part of the designation, the adjective, for instance, common or durum, serves to describe the precise form, the species of the plant or animal. In practice, when only one species of plant or animal is dealt with, species are called by their generic names, such as wheat, pine, horse, sheep, goat, etc. If several closely related species are dealt with in practice, either both names are given. Common wheat, durum wheat, or one of the species is called by its generic name. For instance, common wheat is designated as wheat, and the other species are called by different names. Thus, T. dacum may be called emmer. So, he's speaking very practically. Like, he's speaking in terms of how farmers are working with these different life forms. Remember, LYSENKO is a barefoot scientist. He's not a scientist stuck in a lab, dilly-dallying with abstract bullshit. He's a guy barefoot on the ground actually dealing with these things in a practical sense. And his goal, again, is to feed people. The very structure of living nature, consisting as it does of groups of species similar in many respects, yet at the same time delimited, distinct, not interbreeding under ordinary conditions of life, suggests to naturalists ages ago that species originate from other species. So, because groups of species are similar in many respects, yet at the same time separate, delimited, and distinct, and not interbreeding under ordinary conditions of life, it suggested to naturalists ages ago that species originate from other species, that closely related species have much in common, and that this which they have in common and which indicates that they are connected in origin is what characterizes them as a genus. So even though there's different species, they have things in common that tell us they have a common origin and which therefore can be qualified as a genus. This is basic kind of biology 101 stuff. Hence, living nature itself dictated to science the binomial nomenclature of species. Okay, Lysenko is saying something very simple. The way, in the practical sense, people deal with life forms, farmers and stuff like that, this dictated to science why there's a binomial nomenclature of species, which includes the genus and it includes the species. The genus and the species. That's why there's this distinction. Because although some species are separate and cannot cross and interbreed, they're similar enough to denote being part of a genus, i.e., organisms that share nonetheless a common origin. You guys get it? We're not at Lysenko pilled yet. We're introducing basic biology. Before the advent of Darwinian biology, a metaphysical, anti-scientific view of species prevailed. Species were considered invariable and by no means interconnected in origin and development. It was argued that no species could have descended from another species, that a separate act of creation had brought each species into existence independently of all others. So before Darwin, the view that more or less prevailed was that all species exist because they were separately created as kind of like forms, I almost want to say platonic forms, that are completely separate and independent from one another in origin. Darwin's chief significance, okay, we're going to get to it. Lamarck, and more particularly Darwin in his theory of evolution, utterly refuted the false assertion of the metaphysical biologists that species are eternal and fixed and that they originate independently of each other. Let's do a rundown of this. The claim you're going to see that Lysenko outright rejected Darwin in favor of Lamarck is a lie. It's just not true. Lysenko recognized Darwin's achievement for biology, and he defined that achievement in terms of the rejection of metaphysical biology, according to which species are eternal and fixed and originate independently of each other. Many held evolution before Darwin, but we're talking about the origin of species, 1. 2, we're talking about which ideas prevailed. There were ideas of evolution before Darwin, but the view that prevailed was that species were originating independently of each other that exist now. At least in Europe, that was the case. Darwin, in his doctrine of evolution, demonstrated that plant and animal form species originate from each other. He thus supplied the proof that living nature has its history, its past, present, and future. This is one of the immortal services performed by Darwin's theory. But Darwinism is based on one-sided and continuous evolutionism. Darwin's theory of evolution proceeds from a recognition of quantitative changes only. It refuses to take cognizance of the compulsory, law-governed nature of transformations, of transitions from one qualitative state to another. Yet without the conversion of one qualitative state into another, without the genesis of new qualitative state within the old, there is no development but only an increase or decrease of quantity. Only what is usually called growth. What is Lysenko saying here? He's saying what a lot of biologists today say, or were saying. There's a straight line from RNA world to human beings. In this straight line, there is no fundamentally qualitative change. There is change in the nature and function of organisms, obviously, they acknowledge that, but at no point is there a discontinuity from RNA world to now that established is a qualitatively new form. And what the biologists in Lysenko's time were saying, and what they still kind of presuppose even now, is basically this idea that organisms are merely nutritive soil for the perpetuation of not DNA, but genes. The gene is the substance, it is the essence around which the organism is merely nutritive soil. This is very much Anglo-metaphysics. Anglo-metaphysics, which holds the only real thing in nature, not only in biology, but in nature in general, is some pure essence, some pure constant around which all forms are ephemeral, fleeting, and not themselves qualitatively distinct sites of being. Only a one-sided and continuous conception of being is what characterizes Anglo-Saxon metaphysics. According to Anglo-Saxon metaphysics, being is not dialectical. It is not wrought with discontinuities that give rise to qualitatively different forms with which being is able to exist independently and autonomously as an active site of being. These are merely fleeting, ephemeral, unreal, transient, and temporary forms which are the nutritive soil of some kind of fixed, continuous essence. I think RNA world is basically that fantasy, right? The original primordial essence transposed to the past in time. So for the Darwinists, let's say you have a tiger. A tiger isn't a qualitatively distinct form, but a merely transient and ephemeral form, a type of costume that the real essence, the DNA or the gene, is wearing. So the difference between a tiger, for example, and a wolf for the Darwinist is merely a difference of gene. Merely a difference of the gene, the genetic composition. That's it. It ends there. There is no significance to the organism, the species itself, as something qualitatively different. Darwinism firmly established in the science of biology the idea that organic forms have their origin in such other forms. However, the development in living nature was conceived of by Darwinism as only a continuous, unbroken line of evolution. The change that's happening in biology and with organisms in natural history with Darwin is just one continuous, unbroken line. Now, obviously, the scale of that line, is recognized to be millions and billions of years old even. But nonetheless, it is just a continuous, unbroken line of genetic mutations. That's how we put it today, right? There's no qualitatively distinct ruptures that define the species as actually distinct, like almost metaphysically distinct. In biological science, precisely science and not practice, species therefore cease to be considered as real, separate, qualitative states of living nature. In a sense, Lysenko is redeeming the kernel of truth in pre-Darwinian metaphysics and giving them modern scientific perspective. This is the same pattern you're going to see with the rebellion against Anglo-Saxon modernity. You redeem the pre-modern, pre-Anglo view and give it new perspective in light of modernity. This is what Lysenko is doing. He's almost returning to pre-Darwin when we recognize there was some kind of significance to organisms and to life forms. There was some kind of almost metaphysical significance to them. They weren't just the nutritive soil of genes. East India Company is owned by the English government. Yes, I hate to say it, but even though fucking Kantbot has an extremely thorough rundown, yes, he does. All of you guys should subscribe to the Pseudo-Doxology podcast if you want to know more about Anglo conspiracies and shit, because they're documenting that very well. Anyway, thus, in his Origin of Species, Darwin wrote, "From these remarks, it will be seen that I look at the term species as one arbitrarily given, for the sake of convenience, to a set of individuals closely resembling each other, and that it does not essentially differ from the term variety, which is given to less distinct and more fluctuating forms. The term variety, again, in comparison with mere individual difference, is also applied arbitrarily for convenience's sake." All the people who, Kevin Logan, when he reacts to this stream, he doesn't know what he's talking about. It's straight out of the fucking horse's mouth. I described it exactly how it was. Please twist that in a way that makes me sound ridiculous. K.A. Timuryazev wrote to the same effect, variety and species merely represent a difference in time. No line of demarcation is conceivable here. Okay, again, the prevailing view is that species are not qualitatively distinct. They are arbitrary. They are given arbitrarily. They do not represent anything qualitative. They don't represent a qualitative distinction in reality itself. Thus, according to the theory of Darwinism, there should be no natural borderlines, no discontinuity between species in nature. According to evolutionism, the development of the organic world may be reduced to mere quantitative changes without anything new being born within the old, without the development of a new quality, a different totality of properties. This theory holds so great an interval of time is required for one species to arise from another that the entire history of the human race has not been long enough for the emergence of one species from another to be observed. After all, organic nature has been in existence for aeons of time. One would therefore suppose that this was ample time for a new species to arise from an old, and that as a result of such prolonged changes, the appearance, the birth of a new species should be observable from now. But the same theory declares that actually there should be no dividing line between the new nascent species and the old procreating species, for which research it is supposed to be altogether impossible to observe the generation of a new species within an old one. We're going back to the same theme, the origin of species. This was the name of Darwin's work, The Origin of Species. By the way, 100% Hegelian dialectic we're talking about with Lysenko. It's 100% Hegelian. Do you think Marxism derives its metaphysical nature from Hegelianism? Metaphysics is a tricky question, okay? I would say philosophy, yes. In spite of like for example, I don't know if Hegelianism is an independent metaphysics. In spite of the theory of gradualness throughout, which recognizes no break in development, no transition from one quality to another, and which therefore asserts that there can be no boundaries between species, such boundaries do exist in actual fact. And every naturalist has long been fully aware of this. Thus, therefore, Darwinism was forced to invent so-called intraspecific competition, intraspecific struggle, to explain the gap between species. According to this theory, all intermediate forms, which, it is maintained, completely filled the gaps between the species and thus constituted an unbroken gradation of forms in organic nature, dropped out in the process of the struggle as being less adaptive. Basically what he's saying is that, how do we explain the fundamental gaps between species? And he said the Darwinists had to invent the idea that intermediate forms between one species and another, in other words, you have two distinct species, right? If Darwinism is correct, then there should be a bunch of intermediate forms. But Lysenko was saying the Darwinists had to invent the idea that the reason there's a gap between different species, despite calling them arbitrary and for the sake of convenience, is because the intermediate forms were less adaptive. That's what he's saying. Thus, Darwin had recourse to the reactionary, pseudo-scientific Malthusian doctrine of intraspecific struggle to gloss over the obvious incongruity between evolutionism and the real development of the plant and animal world. This struggle is supposedly called forth by the fact that always in nature, more individuals of a given species are born than the conditions available for their existence to permit. This is the basis on which Darwin built his so-called theory of divergence. Divergence of characters, the appearance of breaks or discontinuities in the continuous range of organic forms, as a result of which easily distinguishable groups, species of plants and animals, are supposed to have arisen. Consequently, boundaries, breaks between closely related species came about, according to Darwinism, not as the result of qualitative changes or the emergence of qualitatively new groups of organisms, species of plants or animals, but in consequence of a mechanical dropping out, of a mutual extermination of forms which are qualitatively indistinguishable and constitute an unbroken series. It's really interesting how, I'm going to sound like a fucking sued, but the The unbroken series thing, it kind of triggered something in my head. Doesn't this kind of remind you of the whole Cantor thing? Isn't the Darwinist view, at least from Lysenko's perspective, similar to the pre-Cantor problem of set theory, of the fact that there are not just one set with an infinite series, but that there are infinite sets themselves? You know, I sound like a suit. I'm not a mathematician or something, so it just kind of ring the bell. You know, it's the same historical situation. This explains why all adherents of continuous evolutionism arrive at this conclusion that species in theory are not a result of the process of development of living nature discovered by science and practice, but a convention employed for convenience in classification. It's almost like Lysenko sets out on the same path as creationists. Well, the reason creationists have a lot of leverage is just because of the flaws of dogmatic Darwinism. When it comes to the positive claims creationists make, they fall flat on their face. But when it comes to their criticism of the flaws within Darwinism, that's the only reason they maintain any ground. It's not because, the church has too much power or something. Thus, a palpable contradiction has always existed and still exists between the theory of evolution and reality, the development of organic nature. Darwinism could therefore only explain, somehow or other, the development of the organic world, but the explanation given could not serve as an effective theoretical basis for practical transformation, could not supply the theoretical foundation for a planned alteration of living nature in the interest of practical life. Darwinism doesn't allow us to actually intervene in the natural world in a practical way. Lysenko is saying it's too metaphysical, it's too greedy, it's too theoretically greedy, it's not put into practice. There's aspects of it that just disallow it from being put into practice in a way that Lysenko is coming at it from. Well, aren't church's ideas the base for many of these Western ideals? Yes. Just because something originates with Christianity doesn't mean it's wrong, though, by the way. Because there's a truth to all religion themselves. If you're a Marxist, you agree with that. Although unable to his day to overcome Darwinian evolutionism in science, the eminent biologist K.A. Timiryazev, an ardent fighter against idealism and reaction in science, clearly perceived that species are not conventions but real phenomena of nature. Darwin tells us that species are mere convenience. This guy, a fighter against idealism in science, is saying species are real phenomena in nature, not just our own convenience. He therefore wrote, "These borderlines, these sundered links of the organic chain, were not introduced by man into nature, but forced upon him by nature. This real fact requires a real explanation. We don't just impose species upon nature out of convenience. We have a concept of species because it actually reflects something in reality itself. But no such real explanation could be forthcoming from the standpoint of continuous evolutionism." And Timiryazev himself did not go beyond the erroneous Darwinian statement that this fact was the result of the supposed existence of intraspecific competition. Only in our time and country, in the land of victorious socialism, where dialectical materialism, developed in the works of Comrade Stalin, is the dominant world outlook, has it become possible to give a real explanation of real biological facts such as species. So no, Lysenko is not shoehorning reality to fit dialectical materialism. He's saying dialectical materialism has allowed us to look at it in a way we weren't able to before. You see the difference? Before dialectical materialism, we didn't even have the ability to address this problem, according to Lysenko. So it opened up a possibility. It wasn't some shoehorning of reality to fit some ideology. Okay?